Hello, Lynn, Kathy.
Hiya.
Well, did you have the hailstones a few minutes ago?
Yep, we certainly did.
Thunder and I was trying to get my beans in, but I gave up.
Yes. No, we haven't got ours in yet.
I grew mine in yogurt pots, and they're getting a bit, bit big. So I thought I'd have
We
a go.
haven't even planted ours in anything yet. We'll put it in the garden straight away and see what happens. It worked last year, so it'll probably be fine.
Yeah, well, that's quite a normal thing to do. So if you're putting them in pots, you have to do it April, and if you're going to put them in the ground, you can do it May, but you don't want to do it too early.
Well, it's too cold anyway. It's freezing.
Well, looking at my thermometer, it's not been that cold, for plant-wise, as long as it doesn't frost.
No.
I mean, I know we feel chilly because it gets hot and gets cold, and you don't know where you are, do you?
You don't really know. But never mind.
So it gives us something to talk about, doesn't it, the weather?
Well, it does, yes.
Afternoon, everyone. Good to see you all, and thanks for coming on. Yes, we seem to be getting April showers, don't we? I think across May, but there we go. Well, April and May gives a very good in for today's talk, which is on the lute songs of John Dowland. John Dowland was essentially a madrigal writer, but also a songwriter, and he's someone who, to me, has been very important, someone I've enjoyed studying and seeing. Now, lots of you will be able to see our presentation there. The first thing we're going to do is dive straight into the deep end with this, and I'm going to play you a YouTube recording of some Dowlands. So all I need to just make sure is that you can hear the sound. So if you can't hear the sound, please just let me know. But we'll start with this piece, Unquiet Thoughts. Unquiet thoughts, Good, brilliant. Well, I think that gets us just nicely started. Here is a picture of John Dowland, and quite a long life, 1563 to 1626, particularly for that time. But actually some contemporaries of his, you think Thomas Tallis lived into his 80s, William Byrd, I think, lived into his 60s. So this was a considerable lifespan. But what's slightly more crucial about John Dowland was the lifespan in terms of the musical styles he was encountering. What you heard just then in Unquiet Thoughts, which is a piece I'll talk about briefly soon, is obviously a very Renaissance style of use of the lute, 4 parts of voices, but then also this very madrigalian style. Lots of us will have an idea of what a madrigal is in our heads, whether that's now is the month of Maying, is one of the most famous. So it's that, but with a lot of this sort of contrapuntal writing that William Byrd knew of as well. One of the really interesting things about John Dowland was, as I say, these styles, and he leaves us prefaces in his books that give us some insight into how he was feeling about these various things. Well, let's just move on to the next one. I'll just talk about John Dowland briefly and come back to that. So John Dowland was born in London, but possibly born in Dublin. We think this because there was one song which he devoted to someone who was Irish, and he wrote "My Fellow Countrymen." So we have suspicions he might have been born in Dublin, but nevertheless, he ended up in London, and was obviously moving in courtly circles because he was working in the court and ended up in Paris as a servant to the ambassador at the time, who was Sir Henry Lee, who is someone we will talk about later as well. Around that time with his lute, he made an unsuccessful application to become a lute player at the court of Elizabeth I, which is a great shame as he was a highly regarded player. But nevertheless, he ended up in the court of Christian IV of Denmark, where he was there for 8 years, which was a heck of a time. And at that time, he was paid 500 ducals per year, which actually made him one of the highest paid servants in Denmark. So as far as valued musicians go, Dowland was definitely up there and did very well for himself. But that relationship ended. We don't know much about why. We do understand that he used to take business trips back to London, and funny enough, you couldn't just fly back, so that would have been a heck of an ordeal getting back to London to help with the printing of his books. His family was in London. They lived near the Strand. And Robert Dowland, who went on to also be a lutenist and composer, and published a couple of books, one called A Musical Banquet, in which we have some of his father's songs. So he was away from his family for that period, but would come back for extended leave, and often would well overstay the leave before turning back up and continuing to claim his rather large salary. So that was John Dowland. Eventually, he became master of chapel music. We know that from the court records in Denmark. We know there was an incident with a chorister, and after that he was dismissed, and we don't really know anything beyond that. So I'll leave it up to you to decide. And then between 1606 and 1612, he was in London again, and eventually became a lutenist at the court of James I. So Dowland's life spans Elizabeth I through to James I, really, almost end to end of those reigns. But he wasn't the lutenist at the court of James I. He was a lutenist amongst many, and that was quite a painful thing for Dowland. By that stage, he was recognised as one of the finest musicians in Europe, not just in England. We have some of his most famous songs. We still have translations of those songs in Dutch. So it really was disseminated quite widely. Of course, I guess if one imagines Dowland was trying to march up to Denmark, he was probably passing through Holland on the way, and clearly an astute businessman as well. So, but that was a point of sadness for him, that he was never the lutenist or the head lutenist, but at the court in England. And despite that, he was a huge monarchist, a great servant to Elizabeth I. But whilst he was in Paris, he converted to Catholicism. This wasn't a barrier to working at the court, because William Byrd, who was quietly a Catholic, was also working at Chapel Royal for many, many years. But we think it might have been one of the reasons he had an unsuccessful application to the court of Elizabeth I. And we know when he went to try and visit Marenzio in Italy, he tried to make a visit to Marenzio as the lead madrigal writer in Europe. And lutenist, he was caught up with some conspiracists at that time, papist conspiracists, but we know he was very faithful to the Queen. And as you'll see later on, some of the songs are also caught up in those who were less than faithful to the Queen. So that's John Dowland. And obviously John Dowland's works, the song publications I've put here, you can see they're all fairly rapid succession, 1597, 1600, 1603. And we think that the 1597 publication was sort of compendium of songs from about 10 years worth. But the second and the third book, we think, probably were fairly fast outputs, during those periods of his best works. So he was quite prolific, and then there was a long break before A Pilgrim's Solace, and I'll come to that. But that's not the only things he wrote. He wrote some psalms for the church, so essentially hymn tunes. He wrote some funeral songs for a wonderfully titled For Ye Professional Choir of the Westminster Abbey. So we have some of those as well. And he wrote quite a lot of instrumental music for the lute. It's worth just saying about the lute at that time. Many of us would consider the piano to be the main instrument in classical, the dominant instrument in classical music. And one only needs to go onto eBay to see that you can go and pick up an upright piano for, well, most people pay you to pick an upright piano up nowadays. There's so many of them sadly being thrown out, but we have lots of electric keyboards now. And the piano very much from about 1800, 1850 onwards, when that became an instrument that was cheaper to manufacture, has been the dominant instrument. And obviously we have huge amount of piano music written. Well, we have about the equivalent amount of lute music, because the lute really started around 1300s. And lots of you will probably think of Blackadder and the Lucenist dancing around in the garden at the end of the episodes, and those very small lutes back then, which would only have 3 or 4 strings, the medieval lutes. And they became more and more advanced, much like the piano or many other instruments. So a lot of instruments around the time of John Dowland were 7 course, 6, 7 or 8. We call them courses rather than strings, because the strings back on each other. So actually one note is plucked by 2 strings to get extra volume. And then, of course, the 8-course lute developed into the theorbo eventually, which are those very, very long Baroque instruments. I don't have any pictures today, but I'll leave them think about that. Good, so those are the Book of Songs, and the one I'm going to focus on today is the first book, which was 1597. I'm just going to stop sharing the screen for one moment. There we are. And carry on presenting here. So we know obviously he was 36 years old when he published the first book, which actually was a relatively late publication in his life, but thankfully he lived a lot longer, and we have more songs by him. And the first book was exceptionally popular. It was reprinted 6 different occasions. So we have the 1597 publication, and it was reprinted in 1600, 1603, 1606, 1608 and 1613, which for that time was a heck of a publication if you were able to reprint 5 more times. And it was disseminated throughout Europe. Most of the songs are in 4 parts, and there's a malleability within those parts. What I'm going to do now, just show you, I have some of the facsimiles here. I'm involved with a group who does lots of singing of these. We've got the first book, the second book, the third book, and of course Pilgrim's Solace at the end. And these slightly flashy editions might have music on the inside that might make someone panic on a Wednesday evening at Epworth, because we are in facsimile here. And there's lots you can pick out. If I show you just at the top there, you can see quite clearly the semi-breve and a minim, semi-breve and a minim, semi-breve. So actually that would be now, oh now, I needs must part. So it's actually not a million miles away from the music we look at now. And in fact, it was around this time that music was starting to be standardised in notation as we moved from the church more towards the secular. So with those number of reprints, it's fair to say that John Dowland was probably almost the first pop star of his day. It would be the equivalent of the Beatles storming on in the 1960s. With their first albums, in terms of the dissemination of music and how well known it became, and particularly this book, which is one of the things I want to talk about. And obviously one of the things we do know is that these books were often devoted to people. This one is devoted to the Right Honourable Sir George Carey of the Most Honourable Order of the Garter. So this really was for high society, as it were, or the lords and those in the upper parts. as would have been the case because music was expensive. And one of the things with these books, I will try and remember to talk about later, is the way you sing from them and how you kept the cost down of buying these books. But singing, of course, was a huge pastime. And obviously we know from looking at things like the bird masses, the bird mass in 3 parts, 4 parts, 5 parts, that the idea of that was to provide masses that could be sung, albeit for recusant Catholic masses in the homes. Masses that could be sung depending how many voices you had with your parts. Sometimes a part might get substituted by a viol or something, which brings me nicely onto this. That first page of this absolutely beautiful tapestry, and you can see the various Greek mythology going on around, which I won't go into, but obviously very connected with everything back then when they believed music to be part of science. You went to Cambridge and studied the quadrivium, and the quadrivium was a mix of science, astrology, theology, and music was very much considered inside that. And the only hallmark of that nowadays is that music in funding terms is considered a science as well, because it's quite expensive. But other than that, I think we've sadly dispensed of its connection to science. It says at the front here, the first book of songs or airs of 4 parts with tablature for the lute, so made that all of the parts together, or either of them separately, may be sung to the lute, or Phrygian, or viol de gamba. So in fact, this idea that you don't have 4 parts and a lute and then a viol on the bass part, and that's the perfect performance. It's very, very much not how it is. And one of the things I've tried to do today with the YouTube recordings is pick out different recordings to show you those different setups. So that's John Dowland. And one of the things I'll just say, because I've mentioned about the different books and the era he was writing over, is actually how the music was so rapidly changing that it was quite hard to keep up with. One of the things, of course, there had been a huge change before. We look at William Byrd, Thomas Tallis, how they're very much operating in the church, although there are some secular songs by Byrd, and how they had to suddenly move from this huge Latin motet things to small-scale pieces in English like If You Love Me, and then slowly working that into things like the verse anthem later on. And that sort of tradition Dowland grew out of. Well, at this time, Europe was really starting to become more mobile, and people were coming from Italy and various places and bringing their musical styles. There was one gentleman called John Capriccio. I can't remember his English name off the top of my head. It was something like John Cow or something, and he changed his name to an Italian name to sound more fanciful. So that was the sort of cultural norms of the time. And at the start of both these books, Dowland leaves a little preface. I'm going to read a little bit from the first book, and then I'm going to read a little bit from A Pilgrim's Solace, which was the last book in 1612. So only 15 years on, but you'll see quite how you get a bit of his character in this. So on this first one, how hard an enterprise it is in this skilful and curious age to commit our private labours to the public view, mine own disability and others' hard success do too well assure me. And were it not for that love I bear to the true lovers of music, I had concealed these my first fruits. Which how they will thrive with your taste I know not. However, the greater part of them might have been ripe enough by their age. So this is wonderful. I thought that what I always find very reassuring reading that as a musician is that even back then musicians were worried about exposing their performance or compositions on the stage. And obviously one of the difficulties you had back then was the publisher wouldn't take you on. You had to pay for the publisher to publish. And if you were lucky, the books would sell, and if they didn't, you might find yourself bankrupt. As actually happened to William Byrd and Thomas Tallis, you would have thought they were doing quite well for themselves, but when they published their Latin anthologies of anthems, Cantones Sacrae, in the 1570s, they fell flat on their face, mainly because they were in Latin, and it was a case of financial difficulty for both of them. Anyway, thankfully not with this, and we have this very optimistic view, and he thanks all the people, I have found both excellent masters and most honourable patrons of music, namely those two miracles of this age, and starts listing various people who are very wonderful and have looked after him and who enjoy his music. Well, off he went to Denmark with the rejection of the job at the court of Elizabeth I, and he came back to London and suddenly found that things had changed quite a lot. Quite a few people had turned up in his absence, and he wasn't too happy about it, sadly. And he says this. He says, I've been to many famous cities and in the greatest parts of Europe, been printed in 8 most famous cities beyond the seas. Paris, Antwerp, Cologne, Nuremberg, Frankfurt, Leipzig, Amsterdam and Hamburg. And of course, and all of them under the Emperor's royal privilege. So by this stage, he's got a lot of confidence in the things he's putting out in the songs. But he then goes on to say, yet I must tell you, as I have been a stranger, so have I again found strange entertainment since my return, especially by the opposition of 2 sorts of people that shroud themselves under the title of musicians. The first are some simple cantors or vocal fingers, who, though they seem excellent in their blind decision making, are merely ignorant, even in the first elements of music, and also in the true order of the mutation of the hexachord in the system. Yet do these fellows give their verdict of me behind my back, and say what I do is after the old manner. But I will speak openly against them, and would have them know that the proudest cantor of them dares not oppose himself face to face against me. So it's quite amusingly strong language that he's getting into this point, and turning up, publishing this openly, and condemning those who had come across. And actually, one of the interesting things, he was complaining that by that period, composers had used a thing called the hexachord, which is a system of working out how you move from one chord to the next. But at this stage, a lot of people had just thrown that out the window. The Italian style was very much to move with the poetry, and Italian poetry could be hugely expressive at that stage. So if an emotion came up in the poem that was very harsh, you'd ignore the hexachord because the hexachord was far too nice. You just moved to a harsh chord. And he's sort of complaining about that, and complaining about people who clearly weren't as skilled at the lute, because the music being written just didn't require it in the same way. So really fascinating. In 15 years, he's moved from being the virtuoso who everyone admires to being considered in the old style. And that's a heck of a thing. I think the only thing I think we could relate to nowadays perhaps is with computers. If you think 15 years ago with computers and the way computers work now, I think that's the only thing we could possibly relate. So that gives you an overview for John Dowland and really what was going on in that period, how well known he was, and particularly this was what makes me very passionate about this music, is because it gives us a real window into what was going on at that time. I'm for the rest of the day, what I'm going to talk about is the book 1, and you'll see. By the way, that's that beautiful cover. I'm sorry it's slightly blurred, but the beautiful cover. The songs in these books, these are not small books. They're quite heavy, and they run to, there's one song every large spread of page, but as you can see, there's 21 songs in this book. You'll be very glad to know I'm not going to talk about all 21 because we would run out of time. But what I'm going to do is just give you an insight into what's in these songs, and then conclude that up by just nipping over to Benjamin Britten, who of course we do a couple of his songs later. But yes, the ones I'm going to look at today from all of this are these. Unquiet Thoughts, Can She Excuse My Wrongs, Now and Now, His Golden Locks, Come Heavy Sleep, and Away with These Self-Loving Lads. In fact, I don't think I'm going to look at Come Heavy Sleep, but I will mention it very, very briefly. And what I want to do with these is give you a snapshot about what these songs are talking about. Because back then it wasn't just all about love and as seems to be or unhappy things, as seems to be the case of a lot of our songs these days, post the Beatles. Good. So Unquiet Thoughts we had a nice little listen to at the start. And I will just stop showing for a second. It's the first song in the book. And what's very important about these books, here's by the way the size of my book. There's the arm. They're quite large, and that's what's going on the inside. We've got lots of music, but these books aren't just about a book of songs. There's an order to these books as well. And the opening one, Unquiet Thoughts. I'll just read you these words. Unquiet thoughts, your civil slaughter stint, and wrap your wrongs within a pensive heart. And you my tongue that makes my mouth a mint, and stamps my thoughts to coin them words by art. So we're thrown into this person who is almost wrapped in the sort of the anxiety of all these thoughts that they have, and then just not quite sure how to express them. And what a wonderful way to start your opening publication, but just say, here I am, here's loads and loads of thoughts, I'm trying my hardest with those, and they come out one way or another. And at the start, every song is all set up as an argument. They were very fascinated by the Greeks, they're fascinated by the way Greeks argued and put debate forward. So a lot of these songs you'll find are a debate. It's almost like writing therapy or something. It's a way of someone expresses their thoughts at the start. Often in the second verse will consider their thoughts and what they mean, and in the third verse try and draw conclusions. And so he's saying here, well, if my heart keeps doing all these wrong things, my tongue keeps saying all these wrong things, be still. And if you keep doing it, I'm just going to cut the string that makes the hammer strike. He's comparing the idea of a noise, unquiet thoughts, to that of a blacksmith hitting a coin, which is also a wonderful, wonderful image. And he says, well, if you don't stop all these blooming thoughts in your head, I'm just going to cut the string on the blacksmith thing, and we'll just give up on all of this. But of course, he then goes on to say, but what can stay my thoughts? They may not start, or put my tongue in durance just for to die. The problem, if I do this, I'll just die, and what will happen to all of these thoughts and lock them up? It's very difficult to know. Thoughts and words and looks shall die together. If I don't speak, if I don't think, I'll be as dead, really. And of course, a lot of religious symbolism goes into these songs as well. And finally, he comes back out. He says, well, have all these thoughts. How could I gaze on my mistress' eyes? How could I look at someone and think anything of them if my thoughts aren't allowed to be? So he concludes, speak then, and tell the passions of desire which turn mine eyes to floods, my thoughts to fire. And it's just the most wonderful opening to a book. He's essentially saying, right, I have all these thoughts, all these ideas, I need to turn them into art, and here's the next 20 songs for you. So these books are real compendiums, and that's something I get very, very interested in as well. Good, so moving on, I'm going to start looking at another song now, and this one is called Can She Excuse My Wrongs? We're going to have a little listen to it first. As you might imagine, this is a plead for, or an apology. Can she excuse my wrongs with virtue cloak? Shall I call her good when she proves unkind? The only thing I'm going to say about this is that her, in this case, is Elizabeth I, and getting on the wrong side of Elizabeth I is generally not the best option. So we will find out what happened later on.
Should this tactical zoom
just going
lens
to
be
ignore that little thing. I'm going to share the screen again. And here we go, everyone.
and wing
That was,
the greatest
sorry, one
mountain.
second. Let me just find where Chrome has gone. Yeah, disappeared onto a different page. Excellent. So that was John Dowland, Can She Excuse My Wrongs? In a slightly interesting version there. Many of you might have recognised Sting singing that along and thinking, what on earth is he doing there? Sting came across John Dowland's songs and was so fascinated by them that he took the lute up, learnt lute, and then recorded an entire album of songs by John Dowland. And he says that learning lute was the single hardest thing he's ever done in his life, which, given that his proficiency at guitar, makes one feel even more humbled by lute players. There's a good friend of mine called Sam Brown, who I do a lot of work with, and I'm always in awe of his lute playing. Having had a few lessons with him, it's a hard instrument. But just a side note, I've had one commissioned, so my lute is turning up in October, and I'll see how far I get. Maybe I'll bring it to rehearsal at some point. You can find an easy song. Good. Can she excuse my wrongs? Well, this was Robert Devereux, the second Earl of Essex, and he first came to the court in 1584, and by 1587 he'd become a favourite of Queen Elizabeth I. However, much as he was a favourite, he was obviously clearly a bit of a maverick. He kept going into battle, completely disobeying the orders and of attack. And so on the Spanish Armada, instead of defeating the galleon of attacking ships, he went after the treasure instead. In Ireland, he turned up with 16,000 men to face the main battles, and instead went down to South Island, fought a couple of small inconclusive battles, and used his liberty of a knighthood to knight half of the army. So Queen Elizabeth then turned up with a lot of people with titles and wondering what on earth had gone up. Well, after these series of tactical errors which had got back to the palace, he thought he was still welcome back in England. Turned up, very much wasn't, realised this, and so went straight to the top, but not just bypassed all the normal people and turned up in Queen Elizabeth's courtroom, actually just turned up in her bedroom before she was even out of bed. And this level of confrontation, much as she liked him, left him exiled from the court, and he spent his time up in Wanstead. And that's when we think this song came from. Can she excuse my wrongs? With virtue's cloak. And that last bit, wilt thou be thus abused still, seeing that she will right thee never? And how canst thou not overcome if thy love will be fruitless ever? So this idea that she just completely exiled him from the court. That last section is from a famous folk song of the time, Wilt Thou Wander Thus in the Woods? And we know it's from that time because his house up in Wanstead was in the woods up in Epping Forest, and so it's this idea that will he be up wandering in the woods forever. So we get some fascinating commentaries on the things going on at that time, and that's what I start loving about these songs, that they really start to get on the inside, that it was acceptable, almost a way of spreading news of what was going on, was to take these poems that had been written, presumably this one written by the Earl of Essex himself. We don't think John Dowland penned any of his own texts, but we think most of the texts we know some of the texts came from people in the court, but often these texts were circulating around, and if John Dowland was helping with administration at court, much like he was in Paris, we know that these texts would have come across his desk. As for the Earl of Essex, much as he was a favourite of the Queen, he, in the end, tried leading a failed plot against the government. He left Essex House on the Strand one morning in 1603 and was quickly found at a barricade on Ludgate Hill by royalist forces and after a fight, retreated to Essex House, where later that day the royalist forces turned up and dragged him and the various men involved out, and he was tried and executed for treason. Interestingly, 3 years later, in the reign of James I, people who were involved with the Earl of Essex and that failed rebellion were involved in the Gunpowder Plot. So there's a heck of a lot of turnover amongst people in the court at that time. Good. The next song we're going to have a little look at is called Now Oh Now, I Needs Must Part. And this is the next song in the book, an absolutely beautiful lullaby. We know of these two songs, Can She Excuse and Now Oh Now. We know that these were some of the most famous because for Now Oh Now we have texts translated in other countries. So these are the two sort of most famous songs. The Duke of Alençon was 24 years old when marriage negotiations to the then 46-year-old Elizabeth I began. And we know that Elizabeth probably felt this was the last chance for her to marry to a suitor. And in fact, despite the age difference, they became hugely fond of each other. Elizabeth absolutely adored him. And she used to give nicknames to people. And despite the fact that we wouldn't use the word froggy or frog to describe someone who's French now, because they might well find that offensive, and we believe that was still the case back then, Elizabeth did indeed name her Froggy, which was a rather endearing term for this Frenchman who she really was very fond of. But obviously he was it would have been a very divisive marriage. He was Catholic, and that would have upset a lot of Puritans in England at that time. The Puritan movement was very much on the rise. And we think that might have been one of the reasons why, in the end, the marriage was called off. Well, Now Oh Now, I Needs Must Part describes the parting of Elizabeth and the Duke at the end of this. He says, Now I needs must part. Parting, although I absent will mourn. Absence can no joy impart. But joy, once it's fled, cannot return. This a sad despair drives me hence. And this despair unkindness sends. If that parting be offence, it is she which then offends. So it's very much decided that in the end it was maybe Elizabeth who said, I'm very, very sorry, we can't do this. It wasn't him who wanted to leave. We started with a recording of a choir singing with a lute, 4 parts, Unquiet Thoughts. We then had Sting singing round with a lutenist and him playing as well with a little improvised solo halfway through. And then we saw Sting sat at the sat at a table. I'll talk about that in a second. Now we have Emma Kirkby singing. And Emma is actually the reason I got into all this music. I work with her on these songs quite regularly. This Emma singing with 2 lutenists and a viol player, which is a very, very common setup. But halfway through this song, for whatever reason, the lutenist sings the other part. You'll hear the lutenist sing the bass part, not the melody. The melody is still played in the lute. So very much decided, absolute flexibility. They didn't see this, you sing a tune and the tune is the tune. It's far more about the connection. So here we go. Now, Now, I Needs Must Part. Oh. One more time for everyone, sorry.
Now I needs must part, parting though I absent am. Absence can no joy impart, joy once fled cannot return. While I live, I needs must love, love lives not when hope is gone. Now at last despair doth prove, love divided never flown. Sad despair doth drive me hence, this despair unkindness sends. If that parting be offence, it is she which then offends.
Dear I from thee am gone, gone all my joys and wants. I loved thee, and he alone. It was
and so on with that one. So you can see they're very different setup. 2 lutes, a viol player, and people coming in and out singing what they want, what would like. I mentioned I was going to talk about the books very briefly, and I will. You saw with Sting, it was him round a square table with a book in the middle. Well, he was actually representing how these books are laid out. The idea, instead of nowadays we would just go get a nice photocopy or all read off a nice score, is because printing was expensive and books were expensive, you bought one book from which every part could read. So here you'll see we've got the melody down this side. So this is the melody. Now, oh, now I needs must part. So there's the whole melody, and we've got the extra 2 verses at the bottom there. On this side, I've got the tenor part the same way up. So there's the tenor. So you can see quite quickly, if we put the lutenist here, sort of sat here, the singer in the middle, the melody singer in the middle, and the tenor just off to the side, they can all read their parts. So what we do, if we put the bass here, well, we can see that the bass part will read very nicely. I just turn it that way and you'll see, that's the bass part. And so then if I put the alto on this side of the table, you can see that the alto part is upside down. So turn it that way, we've got an alto part. And so very nicely, all you need to do is plonk this book on the table in front of you, and then put your singers at the various places, so melody, lutenist, tenor, bass, alto, and you might put another lutenist here if they can read upside down or people just get to know the songs well enough. And that's how you save the money on printing and buying books. So it's a very, very, very clever way of doing it. It is confusing to rehearse, I'll say that much, because we don't have bar numbers and you just have to sort of work out where you are with all of that. So that was Now and Now. One of the other songs I'm going to talk about just very briefly is His Golden Locks. His Golden Locks is an example of a rather different song. We've sort of had 2, if you like, court gossip songs, perhaps. His Golden Locks was a song written for someone's retirement, which is rather sweet, really. It was a retirement of Sir Henry Lee, who Dowland spent some time working with. And it has the most wonderful line on it. His helmet now shall make a hive for bees. So it's the idea that he was removing his knightly helmet and it should be his hive for bees. And that comes from an emblem from books of the time, which symbolised peace after war, which goes sort of all the way back to Greek mythology. But any of the songs associated with Henry Lee always start on the note B. So there's these wonderful connections that sort of run all the way through it. We think this piece came from maybe 1590, so it was hanging around for about for a few years. 7 years before it was published. But we'll just play a little bit of this. I'll just read you some of the words. His golden locks time hath to silver turned. What a wonderful way of describing someone's hair. O time too swift, O swift, never, never ceasing. His youth against time and age hath ever spurned. But spurned in vain, youth waneth by increasing. Beauty, strength, youth are flowers but fading seen. Duty, faith, love are roots and evergreen. So absolutely wonderful way. And if you were thinking, gosh, that's a bit of a rude thing to say to someone, that your beauty, strength and youth are fading flowers, it was Henry Lee who wrote the song himself. So he wrote his own retirement lyrics at least. So that's something. Henry Lee, by the way, was... oh no, sorry, yeah. So I'll just play you a little bit of this. One of the things I'm going to play now is a singer. The singer in this is a countertenor. And this is something we tend to associate with early music song, that we tend to think it was, Dowland going around and singing in countertenor voice. So instead of, can she excuse my wrongs, be right up in that region. And there's not a huge amount of evidence for this. What essentially happened was a lot of this music was rediscovered in the 1930s and 1920s. Of course, back then, what most people knew of choirs was still the cathedral setup where you had countertenors. And so it was presumed that women wouldn't have been involved with that music making. Actually, that's not true at all. Women were very, very much involved with music making inside, when it was in court or within houses. So this idea it was just men singing was not true, because we were in secular music here. So women were very, very much part of that, and we're not sure whether John Dowland sang high or low, but he could have done either. Both work. Anyway, for the sake of some slightly dodgy historical information, here is a recording of His Golden Locks with a countertenor singing for us. And we're just going to let the advert get past. 1 second. Right, here we go.
His golden locks, time hath to silver turn. O time too swift, O swiftness never ceasing. His youth 'gainst time and age hath ever spurned, but spurned in vain. Youth waneth by increasing. Beauty, strength, youth are flowers but fading seen. Duty, faith, love are roots and evergreen. Beauty, strength, youth are flowers but fading seen. Duty, faith, love are roots and evergreen.
Good, loves it. Absolutely another lovely tender song, and one can only imagine that being around these courts, actually just being asked to write something like a song, and that's kind of it must have just been a lot of hanging around the right people at the right time to get these commissions. Good. Well, obviously there are a lot of songs in this book, and I promised I wouldn't speak about all of them, which is quite important. But I started by looking at the first song, Away with These Unquiet Thoughts, and the idea of this sort of bringing you into this story, that what you're about to experience in this book is these thoughts and this art, and of course each one is a story and gives us some sort of window into the way of life back then, albeit from a very, very unique perspective. One of my favourite pieces in this book is the last piece, which is Away with These Self-Loving Lads. And all of a sudden, after the piece before, it's Come Heavy Sleep. So we've been heading off to sleep, which is something I find the lute does, by the way. I think when I finally win the lottery, I'm going to hire a lutenist and have, like at the court of Denmark, John Dowland below and some grills to allow the music to float up into my bedroom. But one of the last things is this song, Away with These Self-Loving Lads, whom Cupid's arrow never glads. Away, poor souls that sigh and weep in love of them that lie and sleep. For Cupid is a meadow god, and forceth none to kiss the rod. And this was really, really... what I love about this is it comes right at the end and almost just says, all these boys and men we've been talking about throughout this book, away with them. Cupid never seems to make it work for them. Away, poor souls that sigh and weep. Think of the poor Earl of Essex sighing whilst he was locked up in the chamber, and they never sleep. Ultimately, it's all just Cupid, and he goes on to say that worthiness should move is love, which is the bow of love, and love as well the foster can as can the mighty nobleman. So the idea that actually love and relations affect everyone down all stratas. Sweet saint, 'tis true you worthy be, yet without love naught worth to me. And these words, just very briefly, written by a gentleman called Fulke Grenville, who was a poet, a dramatist at the time. He was also an MP for many years, and he was, given it's relevant to now, he was also Chancellor of the Exchequer for 6 years, but he never had to deal with COVID, thank God. So he instead obviously had enough time to write these very beautiful poems. This is the last song we will listen to, but what I want to bring out in this is this far more madrigalian style. So lots of you will know Now is the Month of Maying, all these things, and some of the songs we've listened to today, quite slightly different in that regard. This one's just, everything's off, we're absolutely heading down that style, and that's sort of one of the things that makes John Dowland's work so wonderful, that he was absorbing all these styles and finding different ways to do it. So think of your Thomas Tompkins hats for this one, or Thomas Morley, isn't it, originally, and just see what you make of a verse or two of this. It's very jolly, very upbeat. Here we are, and this time we have a Canadian singing this in Alberta. It was quite hard to find a decent recording, but this one's not bad.
Away with these self-loving lads, whom Cupid's arrow never clads. Away, poor souls that sigh and weep, in love of them that lie and sleep. For Cupid is a meadow god, and voiceth none to kiss the rod. For Cupid is a meadow god, and voiceth none to kiss the rod. God Cupid shoved like destiny, doth either good or ill decree. Desert is born out of his bow, reward upon his foot doth go. What fools are they that have not known that love likes no laws but his own? What fools are they that have not known that love likes no laws but his own?
A lovely line to finish there. What fools are they that have not known that love likes no laws but his own. So that's, you can hear that far more upbeat style there to sort of finish the book. Well, I will finish now just very, very briefly talking about how this connects up to our programme this term. As I say, John Dowland, really the first pop star. A couple of reasons. One, his popularity, but two, the secular nature of his music. He did write some sacred music, but it's not really performed nowadays. It's very much 4 parts, and it starts and finishes. So it's a sort of semi-hymn-like texture. But his really famous music is both instrumental and these songs. And for me, that makes him the sort of the first pop star in Europe. And started this, or certainly from England, and started this sort of lineage of secular song. Well, many of us know about secular song in England, died for a while, really. Let me just pop up a little screen here, and we can see a little bit of lineage here. This is lineage of secular song. So 1600, we've got William Byrd, Anthony Holborn, were both writing songs. Not quite as light as this, far more contrapuntal, far more difficult to discern the words. The words didn't really lead it, the music and the art led it. So again, that's why I go back to this pop image, where in pop music we very much are, the words will tend to be at the forefront of the song rather than the music going around the words. not exclusively, but sort of 1620-ish, or we could call it 1610, John Dowland. And then really the next set of people who were writing songs were Henry and William Laws, through Charles I, and then obviously Oliver Cromwell, that died for a while, and then Charles II restarted with his son, William Laws. Henry was the father, William was his son. But far simpler songs than John Dowland was writing. And really, only when we got to Henry Purcell in 1680, and Purcell was taking that huge lineage, really, from William Byrd. Purcell spent a lot of time studying Orlando Gibbons, who had a huge influence from the Italian school. And we had Henry Purcell writing songs. But it all ground to a halt very, very quickly at the court of William and Mary. And the problem was that the Puritans just didn't want music at the court in the same way. And some of the last things we had from Purcell were the odes, before he ended up writing some opera for the sort of burgeoning middle class in London around that time. But that sort of stopped it, and Handel came in with Italian opera after that, and really that was the end of an English song tradition for quite a few years. We have Thomas Arne, obviously lots of us will know Rule Britannia, God Save the Queen, but I would always caution on Thomas Arne because he was very influenced by Handel. And so really to say it was strictly part of the English school is a difficult thing. It's not really until you get to Hubert Parry, who was writing the English lyrics, and he wrote 12 volumes of English lyrics, each with about 6 songs in. It was a huge output of songs. And he writes at the start of it, he was committing himself to trying to rediscover the English song. So that was Parry working on that. And then, of course, we had the folk song revival, which Michael will be talking about later. That was Vaughan Williams and Holst, and we have loads of beautiful songs from there. Lyndon Lee, Silent Noon, just to mention a few famous songs from that. And really, it was only about then that people started saying, well, I think there might be something from the past to look at, and no more so than Benjamin Britten, who started going back to Henry Purcell. And then that took him even further back, all the way through to John Dowland. And so then we had not only the English folk song revival, but from Parry to Britten, we can see an English song revival as well, and almost the second renaissance of that. After that initial sort of 1580 to 1680 period. And the most famous work really for Britain to come out of it, obviously we are looking at a couple of folk songs in our programme, but sort of the most famous was the Nocturnal after John Dowland. And what Britain does, he takes the song Come Heavy Sleep, which is in Book 1. I haven't looked at today, but I commend any of the songs from Book 1 to you. And he takes that as the opening theme and makes a whole set of variations about 18 minutes long, and then right at the end he plays the original theme, or the original song, Come Heavy Sleep. And there you can see a picture of Julian Bream, very, very famous guitarist, with Peter Pears. They were performing Dowland around that time. I couldn't find a picture of Britain with Julian Bream, interestingly. And Julian Bream, you see there, he's holding a lute, not a guitar, because you can see the number of strings on it is different to normal. So yes, the Nocturnal after John Dowland was the final, was one of the pieces that really came out of that period. So. And I commend it to you. I would say it's a piece it's a bit of a challenging listen, but it's only 15 minutes and it's very, very transformative. If you've got time, do have a listen to Come Heavy Sleep and the Nocturnal after John Dowland. So that's John Dowland, an introduction. I'm hugely passionate about John Dowland's works. I think I've done a lot of work with a group called Dowland Works, with Emma Kirkby. We give concerts, hoping to give a few once we are back and running after COVID. And tomorrow I'm having a meeting with a sponsor about starting a thing called Dowland Youth Works, which is where we run courses for teenagers to introduce them to consort singing using facsimile through the songs of John Dowland. And one of the reasons for that is the vocal ranges are ideal often for teenagers because they've still got developing voices. And this music is a great way for them to really work on becoming a choir together. So we're doing that work, but we're hoping also to bring these into schools and do cross-curricular with drama and history as well, because this music is really is part of English heritage, and I think it gets forgotten, but it tells us so much about what was happening at the time, and is a really, I think, a fascinating way to become interested in history and to become interested in the English language as well. Particularly if you're switched off by Shakespeare or anything like that, I think this can be a really great way into that. So lots of projects going on, something I'm hugely passionate about, and it's been a real privilege to present this to you. And all I would say to everyone is go out and just have a listen to some songs. I wish I could recommend a good recording to you. I would say one of the best things is go onto the Hyperion website and buy a CD there's a very good CD with Yeston Davis. I'd love to recommend some of the Emma Kirkby ones with the Consort of Music, and I'm happy to email those. But even Emma says to me they are dated, and so we are perhaps looking at doing some new recordings soon. And if that's the case, I will be able to pass those around. But I know I'm over time. You're welcome, obviously, do come in or out as you wish. But if you've got any questions, I'd love just to take a couple if there are. But thank you so much for coming. It's been a real pleasure, and thank you. So if any questions, more than welcome to take them. Don't forget to unmute. Oh, that's good, Catherine. Oh, okay. Yeah, good to hear. Brilliant. Well, thank you all very much. It's been a real pleasure, and I'll end the meeting there and stop the recording.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure. Thank